Welcome to the Salt of the Earth podcast. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus tells his disciples that they are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. But what does it mean to be salt or light? What would it look like to stand out from the world, provide flavor, and shine a light to those around us? And how can we follow Jesus' example for our lives? Join us as we learn and discuss what it means to be salty and to live more fully for Christ. Hello and welcome to the Salt of the Earth podcast. This is episode number 25. I am joined by my co-host Jonathan Cobb.
Hello.
I am Thomas Pope, and here is our special guest of the day for this comedy special, my younger brother Stephen Pope.
Howdy.
Rocking the mustache. So, welcome. So, I guess today we're kind of going to be talking about a mix of topics in a way. Kind of growing up in the church and just growing up in general, and also using time wisely and moving forward from the regret of not using time wisely, I guess is kind of a way to sum it all up. Kind of some of the idea here is, like, we've all grown up in the church. Like, we had Christian families, you know, we went to church our whole lives, missed, maybe we would consider us the kind of families, like, we missed very few church services most of the time. That's kind of our background a little bit. But, you know, over the years, it's pretty evident, because we've seen plenty of other people go through the same process, that growing up in the church does not equal staying a Christian or being a committed Christian. Just because you grew up in it it almost doesn't mean anything, really. Yeah. Because you could fall away, you could just be, you know, kind of lukewarm about it. There's time spent during, like, childhood or youth doesn't always equal, full commitment, right?
Yeah, it's like, just because you grew up in the church does not mean you'll develop your faith. And it's two separate decisions, I guess.
Right. So there's kind of, and really what what Salt of the Earth is all about is we want to be fully committed. We want to be fully living for Christ. We don't want to just kind of choose that middle option. We definitely don't want to fall away, but we don't want to be lukewarm. We don't want to kind of choose the path of least resistance. Mm-hmm. We don't want to plateau.
We don't want to be cultural Christians.
Right. We don't want to just say a bunch of stuff but not live accordingly. So this is important to us because all of us, we have this background, but the background doesn't necessarily mean, in some ways it doesn't necessarily mean anything. And I can speak for myself and Stephen, and just from what we've seen, for a long time our dad was a preacher. Growing up as preacher's kids, you're kind of like even a step above that. Where, like, you are deeply immersed in Christianity and the knowledge and learning things about the Bible. I would say for the most part, we would be some of the kids who, like, Bible trivia night, like, we're going to do pretty well. Like, we're the people everyone wants on our team.
Thanks they want on their team.
What?
Thanks they want on their team because we're preachers' kids.
Right. Well, I mean, but to a certain extent, we know a lot. And this is true of anyone who really grows up in the church. You know a lot. You have a lot of knowledge, but we know, the Bible says, knowledge puffs up, but love edifies, So sometimes that knowledge just leads to this sort of pride rather than real commitment, rather than what we should be is humble. So sometimes, I guess what I'm trying to get at here is people who grow up in the church, they have this pride, this assurance that they've kind of made it. They're kind of in the good zone. We tend to think that we've arrived, and that's something that no one as a Christian should ever do, is think that you are there, think that you have everything that you need, and then, I don't really need to grow much except for maybe a few small things, right? And so when we come to that decision of we've arrived, growth stops, right? We stop seeking new things. We kind of just get content. So the reason we're kind of talking about this, because at least for me, this is very much my experience where I became a Christian, and then through most of my teenage years, wasn't really with the program. And I know from talking with Stephen that some of that is true as well. So I guess this question is to each of you, and then I can maybe answer it as well. Is like, would you say that you had the feeling, like once you became a Christian, that you were in the good? Like you kind of, to some degree, made it? So either of you can answer that. Would you say that you had the feeling that you'd made it after you became a Christian?
I feel like a motivator for a lot of people to become Christians is the fear of going to hell. So when you get baptized and you are young and initially on fire, I would say that fear goes away kind of. You're still excited. But I've talked with other people, and they would say that the fear of going to hell was a big motivator. So, after you're baptized, there's definitely that the danger of thinking you're in the clear. I go to church every Sunday. I participate. I'm in a good family. I'm not as I'm not as bad as other kids. The thoughts that cross your mind.
Yeah.
But you're not seeking it like you maybe once were, and it's easy to fall into that rut.
That's a good point. Just the fear of hell is a powerful motivator, and it should be. And sometimes, especially for younger people when they become Christians, that can sometimes be the primary motivator. And of course, over time, we have to move away from that. That can't be the only thing motivating us, right? So, I mean, it's a good point, though, like, in that way, like, yes, that fear is and should be alleviated. So in that way, you should feel more secure. You should feel more safe. But again, we have to move past that being the only motivator, because if you just stay in that spot of like, oh, right now I'm doing the right thing, so I'm not going to hell, and then you stop and you don't obey any of Jesus's commandments, you don't grow the way you should, then that's not what we're supposed to be doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'd say you also rely upon, got baptized when I was 8. You rely upon your parents' faith, and that if you don't ever seek it on your own, then it's going to remain at that. And something that's not yours is never going to be as on fire as it should be, or as loved as it should be.
Right.
And it's hard to hold up when you're no longer in your parents' household, or...
Suddenly you're the one getting asked all these questions, and it's like, well, I was raised and this was taught, and this is what my parents believed or thought. So, but you couldn't point to it in the Bible. And, if you don't have that longing for knowledge and finding it out yourself, if you're just copying off of someone else's paper to get a good grade in the test, so to speak, then it's not going to work out.
How about you, Jonathan? What are your kind of feelings around that? Like, when you first became a Christian?
Yeah, no, it was the same thing as, like, I knew that in order to go to heaven, I needed to be baptized, and I feel like that kind of led to a very legalistic thought process towards being a Christian, of doing these things so that I can go to heaven and not go to hell.
Right.
And that was a very, as a teenager, it was kind of difficult to feel motivated to be good, because I was doing things the way that I thought they should be done, not out of a sense of motivation.
Right, right.
Because that the initial, like, get baptized so you can go to heaven kind of followed up with, or kind of led into the idea of trying to check these boxes to do the right thing, be a good Christian. And then I don't know when it was, but it was sometime much later where I actually tried to, the mindset kind of switched.
Yeah, it kind of changes over time, or more of a sudden transit, or at least you can't place the time.
I can't place the time, but I think it was more of a, over the course of a month or a year, I would say, or 6 months or so.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a good point. The idea of like, we have these ideas of, you mentioned checklists. It's pretty common to go towards well, I mean, in a certain way, that's just how we're wired as humans. Really, is what are the things that I need to do in order to get what I want, right?
Yeah.
And we apply the same approach to heaven, which is unfortunately and fortunately not how it works. We can't really just do that because we're not the ones doing the real work. And when we have that mentality, we are in the wrong in a way.
Also, it's fighting an impossible battle because there's no way we can maintain a perfect slate by trying to do the right things.
Right. And a lot of times what ends up happening is we develop our list of like, as long as I do these things, I'm in the good.
Yeah.
Right. And it's usually we'll pick, a handful of like what we consider to be the worst or most obvious sins or whatever, like, oh, I don't steal, I don't murder, I don't swear, I go to church, we pick our obvious list and we stick to that, and inevitably, even then, we're usually going to do it imperfectly. So we either have to make our list shorter, or, well, I guess there's kind of three options. We make our list shorter, we just feel terrible about ourselves all the time, or our perspective has to change. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, unfortunately, the perspective changes. We move away from being Christians. That's what people do. But the perspective should change toward, that's not how grace works.
This is something every person who grows up in the church has to deal with when they get to that point of making their faith their own. Because if you do just rely on your parents, or if you move away and you go to a church because that's what you've been doing your whole life, then if your faith isn't your own and the church is being influenced by culture instead of the church influencing your culture, mm-hmm. and your church begins to change, well, you don't have the knowledge, you don't have the time spent in the Bible to object to this. You don't have, you can't call out other people's wrongs if you can't even tell them where what you believe is in the Bible. So there's in many ways, people who weren't born in the church and come to the church, they found what they believe and they can tell you about it. And in many ways, they're probably stronger than people who are raised in the church and couldn't tell you, we've been going to this church for 60 years and they're the same as they were 40 years ago. And right. There's no growth. There's no desire to help the church or take a more responsibility in the church. It's a place you go to every Sunday.
Right. In a way, almost the people we're talking to here, or at least the people who maybe need to hear this kind of stuff the most, are the people who, their parents are Christian. They grew up in the church in some way, or somehow being, I guess, poured into different, biblical stories or Christian knowledge, things like that. These are the people we're kind of talking to here, because they're the ones who need to make this decision. Because right now they have, you have all this knowledge, especially you're a teenager or something, but you still have to make it your own. And there's that moment where we all have to make our own choices. We have to choose our own path. We have to make the religion our own, or we're just going to be borrowing something from somebody else. And it's especially the danger for us because we grew up in the church, or we grew up with, a preacher as a dad, and we're especially susceptible to that complacency of having made it in a way. Whereas first generation Christians, people who, don't know anything about Christianity and then come to find it out and believe on their own, they have reasons. They're usually, you look at those people and they're usually they're more devout, they're more serious, especially sometimes we see that in like other countries, when there's missionaries doing work, is sometimes missionary movements are so exciting because the people who get converted, they're super with it, they're on fire, like they really believe and they're really repentant for their sins. So in a way, we kind of have to get to that same place, even though our background is different, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that just made me think of like people that in America, people convert to the church or to faith. They know why they're a Christian, but they still struggle with sin. And then we think because we don't struggle with sin that we're better off, because we've never been raised in these cycles of sin, that we have this advantage. But really, it's better to have a sin and fight it than to just be complacent, I guess.
Yeah, I mean that it's a valid point to think of. People who grew up Christian in Christian families, and I should say, they don't have a lot of the more obvious sins. They're in a real way given a great advantage as far as they usually have a more stable family.
Yeah,
they're usually kept away from a lot of things, and they don't usually have a lot of those more obvious external sins. However, we have all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We all have those internal things.
Yeah.
And sometimes, and I've heard it before. I've even felt that way myself. It's like people saying things like, I don't really feel like I have sins. I don't know how I'm sinning. We can't see it. It's there, but sometimes with the more nuanced or internal things, we don't realize it as much. So I guess kind of going, I guess giving my answer to the question, I would say I felt the same way in a lot of ways as far as, I had the fear of hell, but I didn't have the full realization of the weight of my own sins, like how bad they were, that they were the reason that I was going to hell. It was more just like, I would go to hell because I didn't become a Christian, because I wasn't baptized, right? It wasn't personally realizing, I've done bad things. And so because of that leads to kind of the same thing where, now I'm not going to hell anymore, but the sins are still there. So it almost in a way didn't feel like there was a very big difference between before becoming a Christian and afterwards, because I didn't realize I didn't really realize the weight of sin, and so the weight wasn't lifted in a way, I guess. So for a few years during teenage years, it was kind of, that was the way it was. It's not realizing it, not really significantly changing in any way, thinking I was pretty well in the right.
Yeah, especially if you're becoming a Christian when you're young and you don't really have any of those real sins, like grown-up sins yet. But obviously,
or you don't realize them, and I think some of that is, as a kid, like how old would I have been? I was probably 10 or 11. I don't remember exactly. Maybe then, but a lot of times, especially if you're younger than that, you don't fully realize those things. Your brain almost needs to develop a little bit just so that you can understand it. Mm-hmm. Which is why, sometimes when kids become Christians really young, and especially if this would be true of like infant baptisms or things like that, is it doesn't really make a lot of sense because they don't really have the full ability to be repentant. But anyway, so there kind of comes this moment where we all have to choose. I almost consider it like a waking up moment where you start getting serious with things. You start getting more devoted and wanting to apply yourself spiritually. So we all kind of had similar feelings here. How long would you say that you kind of had those ideas, or how long did it kind of take you to come around?
Longer than it should have.
Longer than it should have.
I mean, when your metric of being a Christian is not missing Sundays, and like you said, I don't steal, I don't murder, I don't, the very easily, I guess, avoidable sins.
Easily identifiable.
Identifiable. Then you're very susceptible to falling into the rut where you do think that you're better than you are, and you start judging and not. Why would you need to grow when all of these other people are doing worse things than you. I guess as far as how long, honestly, probably just a couple of years ago, 2 years ago.
So that'd be, what, 11, 12 years after you were baptized?
Yeah.
Somewhere around there? Yeah?
Yeah, I was gonna say I think it was about the time when I moved out, or maybe a little before that.
So kind of when you're actually getting exposed to more things and you
Yeah,
you're,
so
you kind
actually-
of forced to wake up a little bit.
Maybe about 3 years ago now, actually.
All right, yeah. For me, I would say probably when I started going to college, which for me is about how long ago is that? I've been feeling
Steven and I are
maybe
young.
6 or 7 years
Thomas
old.
is a little bit
6 or
older.
7 years ago is when I would say like the first kind of
Really?
waking up started. That was, I mean, it was, yeah, when I started college, because even though, I mean, I went to college, but I'm living with my parents still. I'm going to college in the same town. So even then you consider that, okay, fairly sheltered. But, you know, all of a sudden I have all these responsibilities and I'm going out and spending time with a lot of other people. And, you know, a lot of it still hits you like a brick wall where it's like, okay, I've got to make up my mind on some things. So for me, you know, even then that's 6 or 7 years after becoming a Christian, before I started to wake up and realize that this image of myself that I had of like, I'm a good Christian and I just need to keep doing this until I die, wasn't actually very accurate. Like realizing, oh, wait a second, that's maybe not very true. You know, I'm not just this good Christian who's ready to go to heaven sort of thing. I'm not necessarily living the way I should be, and I'm definitely not thinking of things the way I should be. So that was when the wake up time kind of started, but you know that it's not like it was an instant process. That was kind of just the first realization of like, oh, things need to change, and then actually waking up itself took time, just like I guess falling asleep takes time.
Yeah.
So kind of going along with that, so took 10 to 12 years, you know, just a few years ago, maybe a few more years ago, but still just a few years before kind of we started to wake up. So what were the things that started to wake you out of that kind of complacent mindset? What prompted the shift, if there was anything that you can think of?
I would say after years and years of filling my life with distractions and entertainment, I guess realizing that it's I don't know, a waste of time, I guess you could say. That and the right people saying the right stuff at the right time, I guess. Helpful slaps in the face.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just a combination of things, I guess.
Mm-hmm. How about you?
It's hard to. Well, I think it's probably when I could start to see. It's hard to describe it, but when I could start to look at adults and understand that nobody has it everything all together all the time, and faith stops seeming so much of like, you get there and everything makes sense. It's more of a journey.
Mm.
When, you know, several people that I knew, you could start to see some of the things some struggles that they had, and you could start to understand that faith is it's not something you have, it's something you are building or you're developing.
So you kind of had this idea or illusion for a while that, you know, the mature Christians that you'd seen in your life, that they had it all together, that they just kind of magically got there almost.
They knew all the right answers.
And they were perfect.
Yeah.
And then realizing that it actually took them time to get there and work to get there.
Everybody's constantly in a state of growth.
Mm-hmm.
Or mature Christians are constantly in a state of growth.
And so that kind of melted the idea that, you know, if you were mature, then you were also just perfect, right? So it's like...
Well, I mean, you kind of... As a kid, you kind of think, okay, once I'm an adult, I will be a mature Christian. Right now.
Just happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's in some ways, that's almost how we treat it sometimes. Yeah, for me, I mean, it's a combination of so many things, you know, moving out and being exposed more with other ideas, other ideologies, and then, you know, even simple things like, you know, my mom leaving notes in my Bible that I hadn't read them like all summer, hadn't touched my Bible, and things like that, you know, send the chill down your spine, where it's like, you know, this is right. Like, I'm not reading my Bible. And then also just, like I mentioned earlier, finally coming to realize the weight of my sins, you know, realizing that I was not actually that perfect good person that I thought I was. Kind of just breaking down that deception a little bit. And then, you know, over time things start to change. I can remember like first, like going to church, being Christian all my life, but first, you know, when I was 17 or 18, like actually reading through the whole New Testament, like the first time I'd done it on my own, it was like, it's like this great experience, but you would think like, well, why hadn't I done that earlier? I don't know. It's not like I didn't have access to it. It's not like I didn't know I should do that, but it wasn't until I started to wake up that I even like, I guess, had the desire to do it. So I want to read a passage here, kind of our, going along with what we've been talking about here. We have these ideas of like, we've made it, which we shouldn't have, and this is what this passage talks about. So Philippians chapter 3, starting verse 13. So, brethren, I do not regard myself as having laid hold of it yet. But one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and reaching forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. So here's Paul saying, you know, he doesn't even believe he's laid hold of it yet. He's still reaching for it. He's still forgetting what he's already done, forgetting what lies behind. That could be forgetting, you know, even the fact that he grew up in the church, forgetting that his parents were Christians. But he's still reaching forward to what lies ahead. And then what I really want to get to is what's here in verse 15 is, let us therefore, as many as are perfect, have this attitude. And if in anything you have a different attitude, God will reveal that also to you. So there's kind of this idea of like, we should all have this attitude that we're not there. That the right state of mind, the wise state of mind that we should all have as Christians is, we're not there yet. Even when we're super mature Christians like Paul, who have done amazing, super great things, his idea is kind of like, as long as I'm alive, I'm not there. And we should all have that attitude. And then even in the next verse, though, you know, have that attitude that you're not there, but then also, however, let us keep living by that same standard to which we've attained. So, like, don't stop doing the things you're doing. Don't stop doing the good, but also don't think that that's everything, sort of idea. And when it boils down to it, I would consider the mistake that I made, at least the mental mistake I made during my teenage years, was primarily considering that I'd already made it, right? Mm-hmm. Would you say kind of similar things, maybe, of your perspective, or was it different?
I guess it's just, I guess my mistake was just not seeking ways to grow. It's more just be complacent in my faith and kind of just expecting things to kind of, me to automatically grow more mature, I suppose.
I'd say I knew I wasn't as good as I probably should have been, and I knew that I was neglecting the things that I should be caring much more about. I guess I would say I had this spirit of not realizing how important it was. Not realizing how much it would influence every aspect of my life. It would be the guiding line. It would be in every decision I make. And so I was busy trying to figure out all of these problems and all of these questions that I had on my own. And it was a gigantic waste of time because what I was basing it off of was the world and what the world says is a good idea and a bad idea instead of the only eternally true thing on earth.
And I know you kind of mentioned earlier, you know, comparing yourself to other people, like, oh, I'm still better than most kids my age. So like, could you kind of talk about that comparison process of like, you're comparing yourself to the world, in which case most people with a Christian background are kind of come out ahead in some ways, but you're kind of using that as the metric for whether you're okay or not.
I mean, if you're comparing to the world that you're better than the world, it's not exactly, you know, a great measurement.
Not a high bar.
Not a high bar to set for yourself, no. And it's also you don't really have to put in any work if that's your unit of measurement because, you know, like I said, I don't steal, I don't lie, I don't do these things I don't cuss like these other people do, and but in the process of that, how many other sins are you committing, judging, and things you don't even think of or realize. And again, with those helpful slaps in the face, things that people say, like, you know, you're doing this, or you're maybe what you need is this. A lot of times you don't realize just how not in the clear you are.
Mm-hmm. And that is a good thing to note. I think it probably, for all of that the waking up process didn't happen just by ourselves, you know. I know you mentioned it for me as well. Like, there were people involved that, had they not been there, I don't know if things would have turned out the same. You know, people who, you know, made invitations or said things, or just, you know, were friends, or, you know, things like that, or gave advice or invested some time. They made a big effect. And had they not been there, I don't know if I would have come out on my own, because, I mean, how many years was it that I was doing things on my own and it wasn't working?
Right.
So community is a big part of this, and that's kind of what church should be. You know, we should all be helping each other out. So I guess kind of just moving on from this a little bit. So we've all kind of had similar periods of complacency or whatever you would call it. And then we've all had some form of similar, like, waking up moment where we started to be more intentional about things. I guess the next question is kind of like, since that time, how have we been moving forward? What have we been doing with the new desire, the new perspective toward things?
Reading my Bible a lot more. All those things I mentioned about, you know, filling my life with entertainment and temporary happiness, cutting those things out because it's temporary, and filling it with productive things. It's amazing how quickly you can change. I mean, you look back over the months and and you're floating to the surface faster than you sank sort of situation of, You know, if you don't watch out, if you aren't reading your Bible, if you aren't being intentional with your time, for anybody, any Christian, if you're allowing things in your life, spending time with people that you shouldn't be, then you're going to drift away. You're not going to be in the direction that you should be going, and you won't even realize it. Mm-hmm. So just being very intentional with what I let into my life and what I consume on any level, you know.
Mm-hmm. You have any particular ways that you've moved forward or that you changed things since you kind of started going away from that mindset?
Well, yeah, I think I've improved my Bible reading. Obviously, I still feel like I have a lot of work to do in that regard. But definitely, one of the big shifts is my perspective on prayer. I've had a very poor perspective on the power or the need for prayer before that shift. And that's something I've been working to change.
Yeah.
It has been changing. And then also kind of like Stephen, kind of trying to evaluate what is going into your life that's really a waste of your time or a waste of your life.
Right.
And then also just trying to think of ways to, because I have this desire to serve God because of his love for me, trying to think of ways to serve. And not out of a feeling like I
have to do this.
Should do it, but I feel like I want to do it. It's like I've always served, but I don't. There's a lot of my life where I didn't really feel like there's any motivation for it.
Yeah. Yeah, man. Reading Bible more. That's a big one. Like I said, it's one thing I rarely did before, and even since kind of starting to wake up, it's not like, oh, I have this realization and immediately I was doing it. Like for me, you know, it was still years before I had any sort of a consistent Bible reading or prayer habit. You know, it was kind of one of those things where it's like, and that's a good example because that's something like almost all Christians would say that they should be doing it.
All the true Christians.
Right. Well, almost any Christian should say that would say that that's something that they should be doing.
Yeah.
But it's also something that a lot of Christians don't. And we were all in that same boat where it's like, we know we should. Why don't we? It's kind of the obvious, like, well, if we want to be more like God, we should probably spend more time with God's words, but we don't right away. And so, I mean, even in that, you know, it wasn't an instant process. For me, it took a good while. And then it becomes a daily habit that you have to maintain, that you could let slip away if you let all the distractions come in and cloud it out. And that's kind of one of the things where it's like, even though we've had this kind of, we're getting more serious with it, it's not just like, we can't have the same aspect or perspective of like, oh, now I'm baptized, I'm good. Oh, now I've woken up, you know, now I'm good. Unfortunately, in some ways, painfully, it's a lifelong process that we have to keep working on this stuff. Reading a lot of books has been helpful. That's another way. Christian books and even non-Christian books. Trying to live a disciplined life. Like, there's so many aspects that we don't normally think of being related at all to our walk with God or with Christianity, where it's actually, they have a big impact. Like having a consistent sleep schedule or exercise or watching what we eat, all of this plays into it, and it's going to be different for everybody. But realizing, like, you know, for me, like, I know that if I eat too much sugar, I'm going to be drowsy and I'm not going to be very with it in conversations. So even that, or realizing, like, I should not waste time. I should not bring my phone with me to the bathroom. Weird things like that. No one would ever, on face value, say that that's a spiritual issue. But, you know, it's things like that that allow me to be more efficient, be more devoted. And those habits take time to build, you know.
And to your last point of, even though we know what we should do now, more doesn't necessarily mean we aren't doing it all the time. I was just gonna make the point that once we raise our bar, we're gonna miss it more. So like if we raise our bar from bare minimum of just showing up to church and doing Christian things to actually developing our faith continually, we're gonna miss it more, at least in my opinion.
Well, yeah, I mean the difficulty raises as we also get stronger, right?
Yeah.
So it's in a way, it's almost like maybe you won't get this, I don't know, but like certain video games, your character increases in level, but so do all the enemies. So in some ways it feels like you haven't gotten any better at all because everything is harder now. It's kind of like that in life.
love referencing video games on a podcast about wasting time.
Oh yeah, pretty much, yeah. But it's a true point. We will get better at things, and then we will more will be expected of us.
It'll be
It's
harder
kind of
to.
the Bible verse, to him who has more will be expected. Like the reality is, growing up in the church, we actually, we have some advantages. We're also kind of expected. God expects a little bit more of us in a way. Like I believe.
Well, yeah,
And
well,
you
And
should
especially once we start waking up and we realize some of the stuff, like it's kind of one of those things like ignorance is bliss. Like now we know
yes.
we can't go back. Now we have to do accordingly. Like once we know what the Bible says, once we get more into it, we now have to live accordingly to it. More so than if somebody didn't know. Like if they don't know, they still should, but they don't know.
And as far as what God expects of us, I would say God expects us to be growing. And if we're starting off at ground zero, growing maybe look a lot different than growing from,
Right.
having a background in the church.
Right.
But yeah, I'm sorry, what were you going to say, Stephen?
Oh, I was just gonna say, man, you had to call me out. I forgot what I was gonna say. But you should want to, with growth. It shouldn't be okay, I read my Bible for one day. I'm growing. I should probably do more in my church. You should want to do that, and then changing what you consume in your life. The entertainment you used to love and watch hours on end is suddenly not as entertaining, and you kind of want that responsibility. You change your mindset. You want to grow. You're not content with the stagnant pool you've been sitting in. You hunger and thirst for righteousness.
Right.
You long for it. It's no longer, I have to read my Bible. It's, I have to go to church, or I went to church. It's, man, only 4 more days till Sunday.
Only 4 more days till I have social interaction.
Yeah, pretty much.
I mean, I guess, oh man, what was I going to say now? Now I'm forgetting my train of thought. Well, yeah, like starting out, we're going to have some of those mentalities of like not really wanting to do it. Maybe at first it will be a little bit drudgery, but you grow with it, it becomes a habit, and then it becomes a desire. And then the old desires fade away as well. Like bringing up video games again. I used to play video games a lot. I still enjoy playing video games. However, I do it very little because there's also other things that I now value higher than that. So it's not like the desire is completely gone. It's just like
It's put in perspective.
It's put in perspective, and like time is valuable, and I have other things that I hold to be more valuable.
I've spent enough time playing video games. It's
yeah. So I guess kind of leaning towards a close here. What would be maybe we'll start with you, Stephen. What would be your advice to people in kind of the situation you were, like they first become a Christian, that initial passion and fire is there. What is your advice for them to use the time well?
Oh, they're not gonna like it.
Well, if they even have a little bit of maturity, they'll want it.
So you're asking for kids who are still on fire and not people.
Well, this is just kind of someone in that situation, like their teenage years, they've kind of grown up in the church. How do they not just waste of time, basically.
Be extremely aware and cautious of how much everything influences you, especially social media. It's easy to not realize how much you're influenced or trying to impress other people and completely forget about, where your values should actually be. I think back, and like I said, I've played enough video games. I have spent an incalculable amount of time playing video games and watching movies, and and like I said, I'm floating to the surface faster than I sank, I would say. The amount of I'm not going to regret how much time I spent playing, because that's not helpful, but realizing that I could have been so much further, or I could be so much more knowledgeable, more useful now than I was, or I am, because of how I spent my teenage years. How much you read your Bible. Read your Bible. That's read your Bible's number one. Watch, how much entertainment you consume is number two. And yeah, I would say use these years. Everyone says your youth is the best years of your life. Don't just spend it playing, because you can become truly great if you spend them learning and studying and growing, insteed of, oh boy, end of the day I can play video games. Weekend I can play video games.
Right.
You're gonna look back, and in your youth you'll brag to people who don't care about where you are on the Call of Duty leaderboards, and then you'll grow up and be like, you realize you have a favorite piece of Tupperware or something, and be like, where did the time go? Just realize that the interests that you have as a child, they're just gonna go away, or hopefully they go away.
Not always. But yeah,
just cut out entertainment and read your Bible.
I guess that kind of connects with what Jonathan was saying about maturity doesn't just happen. And I think sometimes we have this idea of like, once we become adults, then we'll be mature Christians. Then we'll have all that responsibility and whatnot. But while we're kids, we don't have to worry yet. Reality is, I believe, teens and children could be on their way to that much earlier. If they implied themselves and if they had people pouring into them. Of course, there is a limit of ways. But I think kind of that mentality of like, we'll wait until you're grown up, and then we'll expect more of you once you turn 18 or 21 or whatever, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't really work.
Once you go to college, then we'll expect you to understand your faith for yourself. Or once you get married, then we'll expect you to understand how to lead a family, or how to be a strong Christian.
Better have the knowledge and not need it than need it and not have it.
And we have a good example of that, because Jesus was 12 and he was amazing the teachers in the temple, right? So like,
he wasn't doing Fortnite dances, that's for sure.
And it's not just because, oh yeah, Jesus is God, he just knows everything. Like, I believe preteen Jesus and kid Jesus was like applying himself. Like, I believe he was paying attention. And it's not all that far out of the realm of possibility that age kids and teens can pay attention to. You're not going to be Jesus, but you could be something.
Not with that kind of attitude.
You can be on a path to significance. How about you? You have any advice for people, younger than us people?
I don't know how to tell people to appreciate the gift that God has given them, because that's really where it all started for me. That once you shift your faith from a desire to get into heaven and not go into hell, to shift your faith from there to a desire to an understanding of the gift that God has given you, then I think then after that, I feel like everything can kind of fall into place. At least that's how it worked for me. So
yeah,
I guess I'm not sure how to tell somebody they need to appreciate what God has given them, but
I mean, you can just say it. Appreciate God. Appreciate what He's given you.
yes, I mean,
They do have to discover it.
yeah,
you
you have to
it's
discover
a discovery
it,
process.
but there are ways you can discover. I mean, like if you're a Christian, if you're growing up in a Christian home and you start to understand how non-Christians live, and not how it seems they live on the outside, but how their family works, how their relationships work, once you start to understand that, I feel like you can appreciate what God has given you, or that's one way.
What's the saying? The more people I meet, the more grateful I am for how my parents raised me.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's a good thing. I guess mine kind of goes, kind of two thoughts is, trying to find somebody who can pour into you, that, that mentor of sorts. I know as a kid, it's the last thing on our mind that we want to go, and we want to find some some older person to hang out with necessarily. But I think it would be good. I would have loved to have that more. And partially I didn't, because I didn't seek it out and I didn't even know the value of it. And that's kind of a two-part thing though. First off, people in that position, younger people, like, you should try to seek a mentor if you can. But then also, this is kind of the part that I'm learning now and trying to figure out is, my part of it is like, how do I pour into other people?
As a young person, yeah.
As a young person, but there's people younger than me.
Yeah.
There's people who, those youngins who were born after the year 2000, right? Or after the year 2010 for that matter. So that's the part I'm trying to figure out is, the two-sided coin is like, we would all benefit from having those mentors, but then also try to figure out what does it mean for me to do that as well? Because we can't just leave people on their own. Like, teens can't figure it out on their own. They like to think they can, but they might do a pretty bad job.
Yeah.
Nonsense. Surely not. No.
And to that point, that is one of the contributing factors to my spiritual growth in my teen years, was having a mentor figure who stepped up not of my own volition, but of he saw a need, but and was a tremendous blessing for my life. And so I feel like anybody that has that opportunity to do that, to bless somebody else's life like that. And I think we've probably talked about this before in other podcasts, but it doesn't have to be, you don't have to be mentoring a kid. You can be mentoring somebody simply at any age, somebody that you could teach stuff to, and vice versa. You don't have to be mentored by somebody that's old. And
as a mentor, you don't necessarily have to be mentoring someone younger. It could be someone older.
It's really about trying to help each other grow in spiritual maturity, and holding accountability and pushing and, encouraging.
Right.
All that fun Christian words.
All that fun Christian stuff.
Yeah.
all the sayings and whatnot.
You know the words.
All right. Any closing thoughts? Any last knock jokes?
Oh, we need to do a redhead joke.
You need a joke?
A redhead joke. But I can't think of a good one right now.
There are no good ones.
See,
says you.
Yeah. Stephen's hair started to lose pigment. He found his soul.
That was the real waking up moment started happening when his hair hasn't shifted.
I was bullied too much.
He needs to dye his hair. That's the real thing holding you back.
Yeah.
All right.
That was a joke.
Well, with that, yes, that was a joke. If you're redheaded out there, we love you.
I'm sorry.
We don't know you, but we love you.
It gets better. No, it doesn't.
All right, so this is episode 25. I hope you enjoy. There's definitely, I feel like, some things to think about here. I kind of feel like it ties together well in some ways with our last episode about planning and goal setting.
And spiritual growth.
Very much so. We should be intentional about these things because it's not just going to happen. It's not going to happen. So hope this was beneficial to you all. This has been the Salt of the Earth podcast, and we hope to see you next time.